So one of the things that comes through in San Francisco is that a homelessness problem, so to say, the homelessness issue, it's a misnomer. It's not a homelessness issue. It is a drug abuse issue. But somehow these things are conflated, right?
That's right. I mean, the word homeless is a propaganda word. It's been around for decades, but it was really used in the 1980s by progressive activists to demand more subsidized housing. And they used people who were on the street suffering from drug addiction or untreated mental illness as reasons for more housing. And part of the reason that you would use the word homeless is it suggests that the underlying problem is lack of housing, expensive rents, or poverty. And that's not the case. And you know, it was interesting. I try to look back on how I thought about these questions. There was always a lot of political activity around homelessness in San Francisco when I was there in the 1990s, but I was never fully on board with a lot of it because it seemed like it was basically a defense of people being addicted to hard drugs and living on the street and engaging in criminal activities, and it never seemed right either for the people that were engaged in those activities or for the other residents of the city. At various moments, you know, people have, this is not, by the way, my interpretation of that word. I mean, the word homeless, the advocates who used the word homelessness explicitly said that they were using that word. The problem is it combines, what they're doing is they're combining groups of people that should not be combined. So the two groups that are in the biggest trouble that are living on the street are people suffering from untreated mental illness and people suffering from drug addiction. Sometimes they're the same people, sometimes they're different people. There's people with schizophrenia that live on the street, but there's also just people that got addicted to heroin or meth that have become disaffiliated, alienated from friends and family, in part because they've stolen money from them or borrowed money from them and not paid it back and basically been kicked out of their homes. To mix up those people with, say, the mother escaping an abusive husband is just irresponsible. There's people that do suffer hard times and they need some financial help. We do a pretty good job of helping those people. They don't need the same thing that people that are addicted to heroin and meth need.
Well, and so it seems like there's a kind of ideological determination, and this, you know, you expound on this in the book. I thought this was really fascinating because I hadn't thought of it that way, that someone in this sort of situation cannot be held accountable for their situation because it's seen as an illness, so to speak. But the only way, paradoxically, the only way they're going to get out of it is to take some responsibility for their situation or let someone else take responsibility. So that's just a fascinating juxtaposition to me.
Yeah, that's right. And to some extent, you know, San Francisco is famous for having treated people with HIV/AIDS at a time when other people were not treating them. So it really comes out of a tradition of compassion. I mean, the name of San Francisco is named after St. Francis, who was a saint to the poor and the sick. And so leading with compassion is a big part of our identity. The problem is, as most people have some awareness of, people that are addicted to hard drugs or even to alcohol and marijuana, which are not perceived as being as hard of drugs, but people that are suffering from addiction often do need an intervention. This has been well understood for 150 years of opioid abuse. We have a television, there's a television show, a reality show called Intervention. Many of us, if not most of us, have a family or a friend who at some point has suffered from addiction and benefited from an intervention or not gotten an intervention and needed one. I myself have had 2 childhood friends that have died from complications relating to drug addiction. I have another friend that's still struggling with addiction. So yeah, I mean, so you have to ask the question, why do people that say they're so compassionate allow people suffering from drug addiction or severe mental illness to live on the streets? And the basic idea is, for progressives, is that the system is bad. The system being our democratic capitalist system is bad. It creates victims. And so progressives only pay attention to people who are obviously victims of that system. San Francisco, I also describe the seemingly contradictory nature of the progressive response to crime, in particular to homicide. And what you notice is that when you look at the data, 30 times more African Americans are killed by other civilians than by the police, and yet there's all of this attention to police killings. Why is that? Well, it's because progressives are really obsessed with people that are killed by representatives of the system, in that case by police. So in the case of people that are addicted to hard drugs or suffering from mental illness, they're not perceived as victims of the system per se. And so there's not as much concern over taking care of them. And in fact, the people that are often perpetuating violence and the addiction are drug dealers in San Francisco. The drug trade is controlled by Hondurans. They themselves are viewed as victims of human trafficking. It's not true, but that victim ideology, the idea that people can be put in the category of victims and that everything should be given to them and nothing asked, is really the dominant ideology of progressives right now, and it's really the dominant ideology of all of our political leaders in the San Francisco Bay Area.
This is fascinating. I want to build on this a bit more because this actually offers a kind of broader framework to try to understand what's happening in our society right now.
Right.
We're looking at, critical race theory in schools. We're looking I think there's elements of what you're talking about in all of these kinds of efforts. What's really fascinating to me is something, you made a note of this, you were talking about, Viktor Frankl's approach to psychology and so forth. There's this idea, life has to be infused with meaning to take from the title of his book, but also that, accepting responsibility is a critical element of that. And it's the same people who might believe in this kind of victimology ideology that you're describing, who also agree that taking responsibility for yourself is something that's important, and agree with let's say Viktor Frankl's approach to helping people, and that's right. It just seems like such a paradox, right? And I guess you're offering a little bit of an explanation as to how that works.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, most people are familiar with Viktor Frankl. Some people aren't. Viktor Frankl was a psychologist, a psychiatrist in the 1930s and 40s. He was in Austria, is Jewish. He became famous for successful treatment of people with depression and suicidal college students. And what he would do is he would ask the depressed college students who were contemplating suicide, he would ask them, why don't you commit suicide? And it was such a wild question, because of course it sounds like he's suggesting it. He's not. He's just asking people, why haven't you committed suicide? And the answers that people gave are ones you might imagine. Because I would hate to hurt my family who I love, or I have a girlfriend or a boyfriend who I hope to marry, or I'm excited to get my degree in college and have a job and a life. And so they would describe goals, things that they live for. And Frankl argued against Freud at the time that that's how people live life passionately, that's how people live a good life, is they have goals. Those goals might change, some things might not be realized. His philosophy got put to the test when he was taken to the concentration camps. He realized very early on if he was going to survive the concentration camps, he had to have a goal. He had to have the right mentality. And of course it was to survive the concentration camps, be reunited with his wife and parents, and to write a book. Well, he gets out of the concentration camps. His wife has been killed. His parents have been killed. He has a new goal, which is to find a new life partner and remarry and to write his book. I was watching old Viktor Frankl videos, actually, right when COVID started in 2020, and I found myself, within 5 minutes of watching them, feeling happy, feeling empowered, feeling excited. And I was so struck that Viktor Frankl was very popular among liberals and progressives in the 1960s, and yet at the same period, that same philosophy, when it became part of political life, when you would say we need to have a better attitude, people need to have a good mentality, they need to be self-reliant, they need to be resilient, that was treated by the radical left as blaming the victim. That's the name of a very famous book that came out in 1970. And I think it's a real disservice, it's a real manipulation of language, because what it does is, first of all, it suggests that some people are essentially victim by nature of their identity, their racial identity, or by nature of their experience. And so if you're African American, this is very insulting and racist, the idea is that you're a victim because of your race. Or if you suffered abuse or trauma or some suffering, that you are a victim because of that trauma. And then the idea, that's the first bad idea, then the second bad idea is that nothing should be expected of people that are victims. But that's absurd, because of course the way that you achieve a heroic life, the way that you become a hero, is to overcome your victimization and your oppression. So part of the reason I want to write San Francisco is to get to that moment. Where did progressives go so wrong? On the one hand, they embraced this really empowering message of self-help in their private lives, but then in their politics, they totally rejected it with this idea that self-help was blaming the victim.
Well, and so that moment, is that in 1970, blaming the victim coming out? What, like, Trace this for me. This
Yeah.
is so fascinating.
Yeah, it really starts. You know, I mean, I think you can. Some of these ideas, you know, you trace them back, and they always end up starting much earlier than you discover. But certainly, 1964, we passed this really sweeping and amazing progressive Civil Rights Act, which prohibits racial discrimination. Right away, President Johnson, his advisor is Patrick Moynihan, who was a Democrat and became a senator of New York later. Moynihan said, you know, we've got a problem, which is that we're seeing high levels of divorce and family dissolution in the African American community. It was a very sensitive subject back then, as it is now. And Moynihan put out a big report on the black family and some of the challenges there.
And it was just a fraction of what it is today.
Yeah, it was about a third of African American families were had parental absence, had father absence. Today, I believe it's over 70%. So they were identifying a real problem. The response from the radical left was that's blaming the victim. And I think one way to look at it is that the left felt like that message of personal responsibility was competing with their story, which is that the society and the system are to blame for all bad things that happen to people. And that's a very old view. This is Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century, who said, you know, that people are innocent, we're born pure and innocent, and then we're corrupted by society. Conservatives have really the opposite view, which is that individuals are born fallen, to borrow from the Christian or Judeo-Christian language, and then society gets them on the straight and narrow. So it comes from that, and then it just becomes more radical over the last 50 years. So I even see in older generations of Democrats, they still had some belief that even people that suffered from victimization or oppression or racial discrimination, that things should still be required of them, that wasn't the end of the story. But it's just became really dogmatic. I think obviously last year, or maybe not obviously, last year I believe we were in a very severe moral panic after the George Floyd death and protests. And that led to a situation where anybody who suggested some sort of reciprocity or personal responsibility was viewed as continuing with oppression, and they were basically just shouted down. That's how we resulted in so many of the terrible policies we saw, including cutting police, not requiring people to follow the basic laws of city life.